Hi, Michael.
Hey, Karen, how's it going?
Good. I'm really excited today because we are going to talk about Stephen Wolfram and Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson and how they intersect on the theory of everything. And kind of makes me think of when C.S. Lewis said the whole show. You get those three guys together and you've got the whole show for sure. And interspersed in that, I want to do a little bit of showing you some art and how that fits into the whole idea of symbolic expression, because I know that was a place that you wanted to take it, was the area of symbolic expression.
Sounds good.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's fly. So I'm going to share my screen to show you Stephen Wolfram's theory of everything. So you can see it on your screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is a visual summary of kind of the main thread of what he was talking about. And I'm just going to very quickly flow through it at my very high level of understanding. But he's talking about using a simple rule that could produce exceedingly complex results. And he and his team are working on a variety of different simple rules that might be producing these results, but here's just an example rule right here. And if you use this example rule, the sequence of updating events begins to produce little structures like this. And as it keeps going out, you end up with something. This is what he calls a spatial hypergraph. And so that's one way of looking at this sequence of updating events. Another way of looking at it is something that he calls a multi-way states graph. And that's this one right here. That you can see the progression of time as it moves out from this initial condition out. And then there's also another way of looking at it, which is branchial graphs. That's this little part down here. And then there's also a multi-way causal graph where it just looks at causal events. And then this one at the very bottom on the right is the space-time causal graph, which is somewhat similar to this multi-way states and causal graph thing in the middle. But the way he describes it is that at any point in time, if you take a slice across this multi-states graph or this causal graph or this multi-way graph, that you're looking at the position of all the space and particles that exist at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's a basic summary of it. So I took some notes on his talk. I ran into this quote by G.K. Chesterton, which I think is kind of pertinent because you know how I love the whole idea of boundaries. Chesterton said, "To love anything is to love its boundaries." And of course, that sounds just like Jordan Peterson when he says that in order to, when you love someone, you also love their limitations. Right?
That's very interesting.
Yeah, love has to include our vulnerabilities. Kind of reminds me of years ago, I was in a mom's group, and one of the older mentor moms that was helping us, she said one of the things that she had learned throughout her marriage was that the older she got, the more she wanted to protect her husband's weaknesses instead of pointing them out to everybody. So that's the growth of love, right?
Yeah.
Because at the beginning, you want to protect yourself by pointing out the other person's weaknesses. Make sure everybody knows, I see his weaknesses, you know, I'm not a part of that. But as time goes on, you want to bring him into your fold and protect his weaknesses. So anyway, of course, I know there's problems with that because that can turn into enabling and all those other things, but I don't think that's the kind of thing she was talking about. So anyway, back to Stephen Wolfram. I'm just going to read a little bit from what he said. So this picture in the middle, right here, is showing this combination that we call a multi-way system that shows these different quantum branches and different causal edges that connect different quantum states. It turns out that you can understand space-time as coming from this causal graph. Space-time arises from this causal graph. And you can understand space as kind of slicing through this causal graph, the space of quantum states as being slices through this multi-way causal graph. So there is this thing we call branchial space down here, which represents these states. The connections in here basically represent entanglements between quantum states. So systems behave in complex ways. You need to abstract a model of a system to see what's going on. And he's using the computational universe of possible programs as models. A simple program produces a cellular automaton. Even though the rule is very simple, the result or the behavior that you get can be complicated. So one of the pictures I didn't bring up was from at 12:59 in his talk. He shows an image of a cellular automaton that's working out. And you can see all the complexity that comes from the initial very simple rule. But down the left side, there's actually a very, very ordered sequence. And then down the right side, it's very, very complex and seemingly random. And so it almost reminded me of Jordan Peterson's thing about order and chaos being kind of divided down the middle. But it starts out with this very, very simple rule at the top. So it's really kind of cool. Now, he says, the thing that bugged me was the models of computational programs I had set up were not aesthetically satisfying. To even get started, you had to get a model with certain characteristics, and that really bugged me. You know, I'm sure the reason it bugs him is that if you have to have certain characteristics in order to get it set up, that means there has to be some sort of intelligence.
Right.
And he's trying to get away from that. So to even get started, you had to get a model with certain characteristics, and that really bugged me because what I wanted to have was this computational universe of possible universes that was a bit more free and open. So computational language design is about how you make an abstract representation of things like computation, and I realized that a fundamental idea that has to do with the way Mathematica, Wolfram language works, is that by using transformational rules for symbolic expression, and I realized that the core idea that is underneath that I can use as a model for thinking about physics. And I thought that was super interesting, that he realizes that the transformational rules for symbolic expression is another way of looking at physics, because you and I have been talking about that, you know, coming at it from various angles for months now. And hear somebody else talking about it in this environment, I thought, okay, there's got to be some real truth in that, because we've been coming at it from a completely different angle.
Yeah. Well, one of the first, when you'd sent me the video to watch on his model, because this is for him is a model of everything in terms of physics. It's interesting because whereas the other models focus on the physical world in a sort of empirical model of all these different things we can observe, do experiments with, like, you know, electrons and quarks and yada yada yada, all these little discrete units of matter that we can, you know, observe all these behaviors of and try and come up with theories of. He's coming at like almost in a completely opposite direction, which is he's coming at a pure informational layer. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Informational transformation. And it's funny because like all the it's just funny because we've had this materialist mode for such a long time, and this is almost like pure spiritual mode, right? I mean, I know he doesn't conceptualize information in that way.
Yes.
But it's this other worldly thing that somehow is able to order and structure what we see.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. And I just found it really interesting because it's so man, it's so opposite to what other people have been going down. And one of the ideas that I found the most interesting in his talk track is, I don't know if this popped out to you or not, but this idea of computational irreducibility.
Yep. I've got that highlighted. I've got it text quoted here. I can bring it up if you want.
Yeah, if you have a quote on it that you could read, it'd probably be better than me trying to summarize it poorly.
Yep. Here it is right here. Computational irreducibility. Even though you know the underlying rule, it may be difficult to predict what it's going to do for the system itself. It just follows the rule, applying it, many, many times and getting to the results here. But the question is, can we jump ahead? Can we reduce the computational work that is needed to figure out the answer? The answer is there are many of these systems where that is not possible, where you are stuck with computational irreducibility. It's a kind of wall closely related to undecidability and Gödel's theorem and things like that. It's a wall where jump ahead predictive science doesn't work. I thought we would be mired in this from the beginning, but it turns out there's a kind of layer of reducibility on top of a sort of underlying computational irreducibility in these models. And that layer of reducibility turns out to map almost perfectly to what we already know in physics. I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah.
So, because if the whole structure of the universe was mired in computational irreducibility, we'd never be able to know anything. We wouldn't be able to have any scientific discovery or make any progress at all.
Yeah.
But just by happenstance, there's a layer of computational reducibility that runs right through the system. It's
Yeah.
so perfect, and he can't see it. It's this gift just offered to us. It's so beautiful.
And without that, what our experienced reality would be, like the word Paul likes to use, random. There would be no pattern to be divulged. There would be no order in the chaos for us as finite creatures. There might be order from some superhuman intelligence perspective, but from our perspective, we could never live in and predict what's going to happen in a meaningful way. But yeah, it's just so interesting there. And so it's funny because he calls out Gödel, right? Which plays into Gödel's theorem, also is highlighted in the beginning of that that paper on Peterson's ontology that you sent to me, right? He calls out Gödel right at the beginning and his incompleteness theorem, and what that tells us about these formal systems and their limitations, which I've always found very interesting, because it's almost it's a sort of proof that that the scientific perspective isn't what we're doing most of the time in terms of processing and understanding the world. It is certainly part of what we do, but if you became dogmatically ensconced in any sort of formal system, you would necessarily die. It almost proves, what Peterson points out, that order taken to the highest degree is actually stultifying. You can't breathe in it. Because it becomes so endlessly self-referential, it can't get outside itself to see the axioms that necessarily exist, that support its existence, right? It becomes this kind of, to borrow from Vervaeke, it's like the reciprocal narrowing, right? And you think of like the concept of Odin losing his eye to gain this scientific perspective of knowledge. And it's just so interesting because they're coming up in both these conversations, there seems like the effort being made with some of the new science is like, whether it's making consciousness fundamental, or what I think he's doing here, he's making this spiritual reality of information fundamental, because he's not explaining. Well, he's demonstrating that the properties whereby this information may be symbolically um, um, transformed is what he's focusing on, but that still doesn't tell you anything about the computer it's running on, or what's actually
Well, so
making.
that's what I wondered about, because he talks a lot about how you can start out with just a rule, but hello, a rule has to run on something, doesn't it?
Exactly. Like, information by itself, is completely abstract. It doesn't play out to what is it that constrains itself to follow these rules. And you could think of these informational symbolic transformations are just, they're laws, but unless you have something that's going to enact and power the law into reality, it's absolutely useless. Unless there's some enforcement mechanism whereby this law is followed, what does it even mean?
Yeah, and there has to be, even though he's trying to create the idea that this thing is, I think he's trying to create the idea that this thing is infinite, that it's boundaryless, but a system won't work if it doesn't have boundaries. I mean, there has to be, like you said, there has to be some error correction mechanism in there, right?
Yeah, it is really interesting though, and part of how he's, in his talk, how he's what's encouraged him to think there might be something to this is that, again, he's finding these areas of what he calls computational reducibility that do correspond with things like the way the states of quantum physics are being modeled, and so forth, and there's something in it that seems to play nicely with this, where those that computational reducibility lies, which is very interesting. And one of the things I keep thinking about when I hear this idea of computational reducibility is I keep thinking about meaning as the kind of corollary in terms of Peterson speak, because if you think about what's going on with meaning, it's this attempt to extract from all the data some sort of pattern that is stable across the longest periods of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so like, when we say meaning, that it's a word that means lots of different things, but it's meaningful for something. Like it's in that story mode of, okay, to what end? What is the telos? So when you talk about the meaning of a human life, it's like, well, measured to what end of human existence? Or if you're in the trying to do anything, whether it's something simple, getting from point A to point B, everything within that frame is meaningful towards that specific end of whatever the thing that's being accomplished. So it has this this kind of dynamic reality that's it's that attempt to look ahead so that you can make the predictions necessary to survive.
I
That
think
Peterson.
there's a two-part thing there. Part of it is the attempt to look ahead. Part of it is the what Wolfram calls the observational platform. That when, if you're any one of those states and you need to observe the other states, they can be parallel states. They can be states that are existing at the same time. Like I can be observing another person that's in the same moment of time that I am, or I can be thinking ahead to what might be coming next, right? So I think there's this two-way thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the observational states, you have your observational position and platform from which you're observing, and that changes. I mean, he was describing how that brings in special relativity, because wherever you are observing from, you're always affected by the position that you're at relative to anybody else. You know, whether it's the speed of light or anything else, your observation is always not tainted, but influenced by your position and the position of the other entity that you're looking at. But then there's also this, like you said, this need or desire to look ahead and see where it's going. And where does that come from? You know, I mean, if it was just strictly, purely a computational rule playing itself out, there wouldn't be any impetus to even care whether something is computationally reducible or irreducible.
Yeah, and that's something. It's something like, especially in the Peterson world, that's very interesting, because you know Peterson's project in some sense is to show how this meaning has such complexity to it, even within just an evolutionary frame, where the only stated goal of in an evolutionary model is survival, right? You know, getting my genes into the next version of the future. But even within that, there's still quite a bit more ontological depth than one would presuppose, which is one of the interesting things that he shows, that it's kind of similar to what Wolfram is doing in terms of demonstrating that from these very simple principles, this something that you couldn't have anticipated comes out of it, based on the beginning simplicity.
Well, and isn't there something in computer language or computer programming that the simpler the program, the more effort it takes to come up with it? I mean, if it's going to produce complexity, I mean, I remember when Megan was doing her computer programming classes, she could sometimes come up with a program, but maybe it required a lot of looping and a lot of going back and forth. It takes a lot of time, you know, and so you had to keep working on it to reduce the amount of time, to improve the efficiency and so forth, until you simplify the program, tighten it up. So it seems to me that if you go back and it becomes the ultimately simple program, that is one that requires the ultimate intelligence.
Yeah. It's very interesting, because I just don't have the language to talk about it, but I just, it would be very interesting if this model of Wolfram's gets more legs, you know, starts having some predictive powers, for some of our physics. But I'm not sure if I'm super hopeful about that. I think, and partially because, again, I think I just it's well, I don't know. I don't think I'm smart enough to fully wrap my head around exactly what he's doing, but it's got its fingers in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, I'm not at all positing that his is a correct structure of the universe. I just think that it's really interesting the way, now that he was describing how over the time since his book came out in 2002, that the use of computer programming computational work to solve problems in the world has gained a much larger share. Computer modeling and everything has gained a much larger share of how problems are solved in the world. And so I think he was saying that his book kind of opened the door for that to happen. I think he was kind of claiming some.
Yeah, he's known to have a little kind of a supersized ego.
Yeah,
he's clearly an intelligent guy, though.
he says certain things, which he says completely humbly.
Oh, well, not really. Like,
Well, I
yeah,
know, but when you stop and think about it, at one point he said, so I thought, well, I would just work on this. He said, you know, if it turns out that coming up with a theory of everything is easy, then I might as well just do it. Everybody else has been working on it for 100 years. But, you know, if it's easy. But it did occur to me that that there is a simple rule that creates the universe, because, you know, everything is, I really do believe everything is in a sense fractal. I don't know if fractal is the right word, but that structures go all the way up and go all the way down. And so I was thinking about well, let me show you what I'm reading, that ontology thing of Jordan Peterson's, and then also ran into this really interesting thing from Bishop Barron. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay. So here's this really interesting thing from Bishop Barron. Apparently, in some sort of lecture in 1961, Richard Feynman was at Caltech and he was talking to his students, and he said, if in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence was passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? So he had asked his students this, and the students talked about it. And now we never get the answer to what happened in that classroom, but Bishop Barron had prepared some responses to this. He was asked this in his, what is it, Word on Fire podcast. And so he thought about it. He had thought about it ahead of time. And so he thought, okay, if it were Moses giving the Cataclysm sentence, it would be Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one.
yeah.
And what Bishop Barron said about that was that to be pluralistic at the level of highest value is diabolic. That was really interesting. Rather, we need clarity regarding the unity of the highest value, which, I mean, that goes right alongside what Jordan Peterson is always saying. Focus on the highest good of which you can conceive, right? And then he went on to say, Jesus' Cataclysm sentence would be, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that is because Jesus is the pattern by which all of reality is properly viewed. He is the pattern by which all things are known. He is the pattern of patterns. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus is the Logos of the Creator God, and what is revealed in him should also be on display in the material world.
Yeah. But I'd say, like, what is it about reality that Christ shows us? And I would think even more so, some sort of statement that includes the cross would be necessary.
Yeah, so what I got to thinking about was, at the very end, Bishop Barron said, the Father loving the Son, loving the Father. And that loving reciprocal relationship of love is the Holy Spirit. So love is at the heart of all reality. It's at the heart of all being. And that made me think about that N.T. Wright article on Loving to Know, where he talked about the loving gaze. So there's a loving gaze between parent and child. You haven't had babies yet, but when you do, you're going to discover that baby is just going to lock eyes on you, and look into your soul with eyes of love. And you're going to have to look back with eyes of love. You've got no choice. You know? There's just moments when, so this loving gaze, it's this reciprocal love that goes on. And I was reflecting on that, and I was thinking that that's really how culture gets transmitted from generation to generation. is because younger generation isn't going to receive what's transmitted to them if it is not accompanied by love.
Mm-hmm.
So the ancestral culture, the tradition, the knowledge that comes from before, that gets transmitted through this loving reciprocal relationship between parent and child. And at the same time, there's a loving gaze between the knower and the unknown. Jordan Peterson talks about how the future lays itself out in front of you as this field of infinite potential, and something glimmers at you out in front. Mm-hmm. And that's what you follow. That is knowledge beckoning to you, saying, come and get me. I'm here for you to learn. Right. So it's the unknown knowledge that's waiting for us. So there's a loving gaze. That unknown knowledge is looking at you with love, offering itself to you with love. You look back. When you approach that knowledge with love and take it in, then it becomes this reciprocal, like even, was it Luke or J.P. Marceau that talks about eating the apple?
Yeah.
You take it into yourself and it becomes a part of you. So there's that loving gaze between the knower and the unknown. And then I was thinking maybe the loving reciprocal relationship between the knower and the unknown is the spirit, the known. Remember, you and I had this conversation last time about why does Jordan Peterson call this he calls the knower the logos, mm-hmm. and the unknown is the chaos, and the known is the order, right? And the known is the spirit. So I wondered why he called the spirit the known. I couldn't figure that out, but I think this is it. That there's a loving gaze between the knower and the unknown, and that loving reciprocal relationship. So this is kind of this this picture of the two entities and the loop that connects them, that's always going back and around them, right? The Father and the Son and the loving relationship.
Well, yeah, what I think the spirit equals the information equals the known. And all this is, again, it modulates based on your perspectival point of view, right? Mm-hmm. Which is different for all of us, right? So there could be like a version of this from all these different perspectives. But anyway, one of the things you said that was really interesting in terms of the love. Well, how do you one of the ways, I think, how do you know that the love is actually love? How does love become instantiated in a concrete way? And I think there's a sacrificial element to it always, right? Mm-hmm. Even in that simple example that you were just talking about in the loving gaze, right? And the reciprocal actions taking place there is, if nothing else, there's the sacrifice of everything else of reality being put to the side, and this holding of the gaze, right? Like of making this other person's gaze the most important thing, and sacrificing everything else to engage in that activity. That is something that is really key. I always think about it in terms of like in a physical way of like if you think about love, Viktor Frankl he said that you can't know somebody without loving them, and that you also in that act of love come to know the potential of the thing that you're loving, and also your own responsibility to bring that potential about. And so there's like this, I just kind of conceive of it as like these two objects that are coming together, because if you think about love in different levels, the highest level of love is always unity, the two things becoming one. And in that process, like the one, like both things have to sacrifice, and they become to know something fully, you take on its shape inside of you to some extent. If you just think about it like a physical, like if this thing comes into this thing, something's got to give way for the two things to become one. So it's usually whoever is the greater becomes the servant of the lesser by changing their shape so as to take in that other thing. And so that the two can become one. So like this thing, because it has the capacity to do so, changes, it modulates its shape so that this can now fit exactly into this. And also that's how it comes to know that thing completely, because it envelops and encapsulates it, but it has to make the space to do so, and it has to experience the pain and suffering associated with that sacrificing of something of how it is now to become formed by the thing it's loving. And so when I think about, so let's say for instance with this Wolfram, his idea of everything, right? So you have this very basic structure, right, that he proposes might be the informational transformation behind all the things that we perceive as physics. We noted that, well, something has to power that. And so what if that is God himself in coming into relationship with this thing that we think of as physical reality and empowering that to be by constraining some aspect of his being to follow these rules and allow for the possibilities of that being to function, to power, to be put on display. I don't know. I always think of like
one of the things that he said that I thought was just so amazing. I'm not sure I captured it in my notes, but he was talking about how at any given time with any given number of states, he is not even positing so much that there's just one rule, but he's saying that at any given node, at any given moment, that regardless of what rule that node follows, amongst the entire panoply of rules that are available to it, it's still all going to work out in the end with a suitable structure.
Mm-hmm.
I think I said that the way, I think I made that clear. In other words, the idea is that there is complete freedom of choice at each node for any choice to be made using any rule that's available to it, and that the overall structure will still be stable. And I just thought that was a beautiful picture of what our freedom is, that we have freedom to choose, and sometimes our freedom to choose makes us choose wrong things, bad things, and we end up in a hole, we end up in chaos someplace. And even Wolfram's structure has to allow for chaos, it has to be, because the universe has got lots of chaos in it. So but when we put it back into God's hands, he turns it into something meaningful and purposeful and brings it back into alignment with his good.
Right. Like I do see models in here that could help explain how our free will can interact with God's plan.
Yeah.
And neither be violated, which is pretty interesting. And I just I don't know. I just find it really, really interesting because, I mean, this idea of computational irreducibility, I find very interesting, right? Because basically what he's saying is that to find out what happens, the only way to find out certain things, you have to run the program, right? Which for me tells me like it has some explanatory power for me of why does there have to be suffering in the world? Why do we have to, why why do we have to go through this process to get to the good state versus why can't we just like, why didn't God just create things in this like perfected state to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something about, I think we underestimate, because we're often looking at things from the reduced realm, especially in our modern day. That's our kind of default mode of being, is to try and accentuate the reduced mode of thinking, to look for where we can connect the dots across these vast distances and be like, oh, how much of a genius am I for doing that? And there are obviously certain huge benefits to our culture and society, and by the technology this enables, right, which we can all see. But there's something, I don't know, it just speaks, even when I think about like just the size of the universe, which the average atheist would use to point out the meaninglessness of existence. I feel like, no, it's speaking to this kind of infinite devotion to the process that we're in, that is of a size and scale that we can't imagine. I don't know. I don't know if that came through at all. I can kind of see it in my mind, but I don't know if it's tracking.
Yeah. And to me, I think it goes back. I don't know if you ever heard that song called "The Thorn" by what was her name? Twyla Paris.
Yeah, I think you shared it with me a while back.
Yeah. And that comes from the passage in Romans where Paul is talking about the thorn in the flesh that he experiences, and nobody knows what it is, of course. But the basic idea in that passage is that we are perfected through suffering. Now, that's not anybody ever wants to talk about. They don't put that on the bulletin board at the church. They're not advertising, come on in, we are perfected through suffering. But that plays itself out at every level. I mean, man, no pain, no gain in the gym, and there's opportunity cost in the economic realm, and you have to give up something now in order to get something in the future, in the Jordan Peterson terminology. And that's why it has to play itself out, because this goes back to, I got so enamored of Jordan Peterson's idea about anomaly way back in the beginning when I first started studying this stuff, because one of my biggest problems with evolution, and I hold both evolution and special creation in my hands openly. I can go down either path in my brain, and I can see beauty in both of them. And I'm probably going to get a lot of pushback from people who say, oh my God, how can you be a creationist? Oh my God, how can you be an evolutionist? But I can see them both. So anyway, but on the evolution path, one of the holes that I always thought was where does the information come from? Because obviously even the first cell had to have some information, and the amount of information in cells has grown exponentially over time. So where does information growth come from?
And because as Peterson points out, you're not just an instance of a creature. You're a creature that has this whole history to you as well, that's instantiated in your biology, whether you're aware of it or not.
Yeah. And and the other thing he points out is, and he wasn't talking about evolution, but that's where it took me, was that you have this single-celled creature in the very beginning of time, and it's always going to stay a single-celled creature with that amount of information in it, unless it has to adapt to something new. And it's that anomalous thing that comes into its environment that's different than what it's always experienced. That anomaly forces it to adapt to something new. And it's that adaptation to something new over time that eventually adds information to the DNA, or at least that's what the evolutionists supposedly say. that it's this constant adaptation to new things that is driving the increase in the amount of DNA that's available, in the complexity of the DNA. And so that plays itself out across every level. It's not just the cellular level. I mean, in my life, I know that I have only really learned when I've stumbled, when I've fallen, when I've run into chaos, when I've run into traumatic experiences. That's where all the learning takes place.
Right.
You know, we lose weight when we sleep, but we don't learn things when we sleep.
Well, it's funny because, like, yeah, you're right. I don't think you can learn without pain. Or you won't remember what you learned without the pain. And you don't, when there's pain involved, you can be sure there's change involved. If there is no pain, then there's probably no change. And I think that's if you look at some of our deepest desires, they do involve transformation and change. And I think, I think ultimately when we look at, like, what we want to have a good story, and you can't tell a story with any richness or anything, like if you were going to choose and make your own life, you want it to be a good story. And I think you can't tell a good story where the hero doesn't suffer. It just doesn't, there's just not a good version of that. And I think, and I don't know what that is. I think that's emblematic of something deeper, but it's something that I don't know. And again, I think too that, I've said this before to you, but I think we can't conceptualize suffering as being good unless it's something that God participates in as well. And I think that the cross is potentially evidence of a larger reality of God's participation with suffering than we might see at first glance.
Well, let's go back to what you were talking about when you were saying that first, for there to be love, there has to be a molding, a changing internally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the theological word they use with Jesus is kenosis, that when he emptied himself and made himself of nothing so that he could be on earth and be a human being. In the picture that comes to my mind is he emptied himself so that he could pour himself into us.
Yeah.
And then also so that there was room in him for us, because he is in us and we are in him. There's this picture, right? Well, in the same way, for God to create the universe, because God is all in all. So there had to be some sort of retraction, moving back.
Yeah.
Voluntarily limiting himself to make, I know that the physicists say there is no such thing as space, but I'm going to use the word anyway, limiting himself to make, maybe it isn't space, maybe it's something else, but there had to be a substrate there for this thing, for creation to move out into, whether it's this computational multi-way causal graph, or whether it's, the way that God spooled out the universe. It had to be a voluntary retraction and then out. Yeah. And so it's this huge, spectacular gift. The whole thing is a gift, Yeah.
What's funny is if you look at the way, like, we tend to build things versus the way, quote, nature tends to build things, like life and so forth, is humans tend to take really complex things and assemble them in very simple ways. That's typically how we do things. Like, we get really exotic materials and we, like, put them together in a rather simple configuration. Where it seems like in nature, what you see is really, really simple building blocks that are in these really complex, like, as you pointed out, fractal nature of, like, where these building blocks, have this fractal nature, and where what is seen at the little scale gets replicated and magnified up to the top. And so I think there's something in Wolfram's idea that does seem to me that models something like what we see in nature. And I think, I think it is meaningful that the universe, at least from our perspective, is infinitely large. I don't know exactly what it means, but I think there may be something relative to the space of possibilities that is directly related to that. And if we believe that the goodness of God is rooted in his creating the best of all possible worlds, we don't know what type of efforts entailed in that sort of calculation, right? We kind of dismiss it away with God's omnipotent, God's got he can do whatever he wants. Like it's just a snap of the fingers. What if God instead put himself to like the biggest task that he could think of, and that actually really meaningfully taxes him in some capacity, so that when he talks about like resting in the Bible, that there's something he's actually resting from that's meaningful. I don't know. I just feel like we tend to use words like infinity and omnipotent and omniscient and just kind of like as throwaway words, and we don't look at what underlying cost might be associated with those activities.
Yeah.
Because from our perspective, we can't even imagine it. So we just I don't know. We don't wrestle with them that deeply.
It made me think about another thing that Jordan Peterson was talking about. Let me share the screen here. In his psycho-ontology, the words he uses, honestly. He's talking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil being the classic world tree of mythology. And it's a structure which extends from one domain, like the earthly, to another, like the heavenly. A tree can be climbed. The individual who inhabits a tree can move himself from one level to another voluntarily. And of course, voluntarily is the key word with Jordan Peterson, right? So in the highlighted section, imagine that the bounded conceptual systems are hung in hierarchical fashion upon an axis, symbolically, one above the other, each amenable to construction, analysis, and reconstruction by consciousness, by logos. Imagine furthermore that such consciousness or logos is shaped by the conceptual systems it inherits and produces, but that it also moves freely up and down that axis, the axis mundi. Now that really fits with what Jonathan Pageau is always talking about with Christ, and that goes also with what Jordan Peterson has talked about in the past about hierarchies, that the best figure at the top of a hierarchy, the figure of competence, is the figure that also moves down into the hierarchy to bring the people at the bottom of the hierarchy back up towards the top. So there's always a moving down and supporting and lifting up, moving down, supporting and lifting up. That's the picture of a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the picture that I'm getting here when he's talking.
And you see this at all levels too, right? Because you see it also even within the Trinity, right? Like mm-hmm. Jesus comes and his mission is to make known the Father. The Spirit comes and he's there to remind the disciples of what Jesus said and to form the body of Christ. There's like this self-sacrificial way that things play out even within the Trinity. Mm-hmm. That is a modeling of this.
Yep. And then he says, imagine that each level of the hierarchy, productive and functional, nonetheless remains incomplete because of its exclusion of much of the world, and that such incompleteness beckons and demands further exploration. He goes on to use an example about an animal that becomes familiar with its cage. So once an animal is familiar within its cage, it's no longer afraid. But even then, when the animal is no longer afraid but is rested, it will still explore, even in this cage that it already knows, because there is always something that still demands further exploration. So, yeah, I don't know, I guess when we start talking about that at the level of God, it gets kind of tricky, because the theologians would say that God does not need to grow or strive or get better or whatever, because he's already all in all. So that is a very mysterious thing.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that it is an important theological point, that God, and certainly in his act of creation, wasn't constrained to do so, that he was free. There wasn't something in him that, like, he needed this as he was bored and needed some entertainment or something like that. And that he was complete previous to this. But I think, again, I don't know to what degree, God's coming into relationship with the finitude of this world, what sort of constraints that puts on him. I mean, if you look in the Old Testament, it seems clearly to have deep effects on him in terms of, like, the emotions he experiences, or at least what's relayed through the prophets. Look at, like, the prophet Hosea, and what God instructs Hosea to do, to be a model to the people of what God himself is experiencing through the nation of Israel, and they're going and turning to the idols. It's very moving, and it's a very deep sense of, it's interesting, right? We just celebrated Pentecost Sunday last Sunday, which is, I was talking to Jacob from the Discord service, and he's was giving me some of the Jewish background on Pentecost, which is that they believe that's when Moses got the commandments on Sinai. And they also believe that's when God married Israel. He became married to Israel. And so they also read the book of Ruth, which is about a non-Jewish person becoming Jewish via the act of marriage, the book. And it made me think about, the church, what the church is in terms of this. The church, in some sense, is the bride of Christ, and is born on Pentecost at the giving of the Spirit. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was a rabbit trail. I don't know where I was going with that.
That's a great bunch of connections, though. I hadn't heard that before, about the Jewish idea that God married Israel. I mean, I always know it's a covenant, but I never thought about it being the covenant of marriage. But of course it was. What other would there be?
But that, I mean, in the book of Hosea, I thought of that specifically because that's what he's trying to get Hosea to illustrate. Is he tells Hosea to take on a prostitute as his wife. This is, very interesting.
Well, that also makes me think about the passage in Ezekiel. Very powerful passage. Is it Ezekiel 16 or 18? Where God is speaking and through the prophet Ezekiel, and he's talking about how he picked Israel up from the gutter, basically. Only Israel is described as a woman who's destitute and naked and starving and bloodied and, you know, just really tragic picture of this woman, and how she's tenderly cared for and her wounds are cared for and she's dressed and robed and made beautiful, you know. All of that is that picture of how he has done this for Israel, and then they're unfaithful on top of that, you know. So yeah, I see the picture. Yeah, that's really good. I did have one other thing I kind of wanted to throw out here in the end. If I could share screen one more time. I think it was, I was thinking about how this thing with logos, here's what Jordan Peterson says: logos, whose nature has been most extensively defined by classical Greek and Christian thought, is a process rather than an entity. The process that mediates between chaos and order, although it is embodied, incarnate. Logos can and normally does generate order from chaos, but can also serve to return order to chaos when catastrophic axiomatic failure otherwise looms. It is an exploratory process, curious, voluntary, active, and communicative, and is primally regulated by pain and anxiety. So that's where the emotion comes in, right?
And see, it's also, I mean, I don't know. I think what's interesting there is that the truth is process rather than like fixed, which is a big idea. Like I've been reading through this, you know, the Great War book with Lewis and Barfield again. Let me read a quick quote from there. He talks about Lewis cannot grasp the notion of truth as an entity above and beyond quote unquote true statements. Whereas Barfield is quite the opposite. He sees it as as a process rather than just the true statements, right? This kind of, you know, when you were talking about like a cross section of time,
mm-hmm.
like that's you within that cross section of time, you can say true statements about that, but you can't. The time element adds these variables that it's that computational irreducibility is what the truth is in totality. But Barfield dislikes the syllogism by which some living and changing object is torn from its context and treated of as still life. For him, truth is something that comes to be. So it's that emphasis on the process. And he says to epitomize.
Yeah, keep going, because I'm just going to pull something up here.
To epitomize the whole disagreement about imagination and truth, one might describe Lewis as by instinct a noun user and Barfield as a verb user. And then he says, Barfield said, a term in a syllogism presents itself as an arbitrary cross-section of a process in time, and therefore changes with the person who thinks it.
So that just fits right here. You just got to see this. This is so crazy. Going back to Wolfram's talk, he says to study a quantum state, to observe it, to do any sort of science really, you have to freeze time for this particular part of your system so that it cannot evolve. So I was thinking about that. If you freeze time for a particular part of the system so that it cannot evolve, what happens? That means you've stopped it from the changing vicissitudes of life, and it wastes away, it dries up. Mm-hmm. If you freeze anything, any person, an apple, it doesn't matter what, if you not freeze it in the sense of reducing the temperature, but you just make it stop in time, you don't do anything further, you know. So but in these computational programs where he's talking about this, he has one slide, I don't have that one up on the screen here, but he has one slide where he chooses one quantum state and freezes it in the computational thing. And what happens when he does that is it sets up this arbitrary boundary that shunts off the information out to the side. And so the area around this part that's frozen loses information, and it loses input. It basically is losing its life-giving input, and it becomes this empty, hollow space.
Right. It says like
Perfect
pointing to some
picture of
sort of
this.
relational reality at the basic fundamental
Yeah.
level.
Yeah, exactly. And then going back to what Peterson said about how, going back to the voluntary nature of the logos, the fact of its voluntarism, which has a very archaic neurological substrate, means that logos can return order to chaos, or it can produce order from chaos creatively, preemptively, as well as reactively under those situations that are already defined by axiomatic failure. And that made me think, I'm just going to read this quote again. Logos can and normally does generate order from chaos, but can also serve to return order to chaos when catastrophic axiomatic failure otherwise looms. So, I've been talking with you about my idea of the great reset, the great reordering. I think that the world over the last 20 or 30 years had been moving closer and closer to this catastrophic axiomatic failure. In almost every arena, our axioms were failing. The political correctness thing had destroyed the speaking of truth. Social media has fragmented our focus and our connection to each other. So we have polarization and isolation and alienation and selfishness and ingratitude and family infighting, and boundaries were destroyed all the way up and down the whole system. Destruction of sexual boundaries, the gender binary is destroyed. All of these things threaten catastrophic axiomatic failure. Then we have this great pause where the whole world stops. Now, I'm not in any way saying that God is the one that caused the virus at this point in time for this purpose. That's not what I'm saying, because we've had a lot of pandemics before.
Right.
And some of them come and go without anybody even noticing. I mean, I was reading a thing the other day on Facebook about all the different things that happened in 1968 and what a chaotic year it was. I had forgotten a lot of those things. And one of them was the Hong Kong flu, which killed over 100,000 people in the United States.
Wow.
But I was 20 years old in 1968. I was reading the news. I didn't even notice that the Hong Kong flu came or went. Nobody even talked about it.
Yeah.
So it is possible for pandemics to move their way through society without taking on the kind of picture that it's taken on this time. And the other thing that I think is significant is that every nation in the world decided to stop, except for Sweden, I think. But why is that? And that has to be because there's some sort of, I'll use the word spirit for lack of a better word, there's some sort of idea that took hold of people. Where did those ideas come from?
Yeah.
That's
Well, I think
an interesting thing to me.
I think one of the things that idea is rooted in is the scientific perspective of knowledge, and having there's something about that scientific perspective that was shattered by this, and once that was illuminated, there's something like we all like there that suddenly we couldn't tolerate the risk associated with that. And so it was like this kind of like, okay, we're going to pause until we can get that back in working order, which I think is a fool's errand. Well, I'm sure there's elements of it that can be updated, but I don't know. I just, it feels like there's
Could you explore a little bit more what you mean when you say that scientific picture was shattered?
right. I think, well, I think it was the case. This has always been the case, is that, you know, as Paul pointed out in one of his recent videos, like the portion of reality that can be scientifically verified within those logical constraints is vanishingly small. It's such a small percentage, and yet we have tried to build a new culture and a way of making decisions and everything out of just that. And so we've are confronted with something where, you know, this is our hierarchy of values, this is at the top, and so the hierarchy of values of how we approach this is all supposed to be driven by the science, and it just doesn't have the the ability to deal with this, because the way science moves is very slow, and it's a very difficult and slow process, right, to scientifically verify something. And what you get out of that is this vanishingly small amount of facts about the world. It's like this really long, expensive process, and it's almost like we're getting diminishing returns out of this scientific mode of being as well. And which is really interesting to see, because, you know, we had in the last century just this enormous rapid improvement in terms of our basic conceptions of the world, and our ability to control it, to do what we wanted to do, whether it was to fly to the moon or whatever else. And so, and, you know, I want to read this quote from the Peterson thing that I think is kind of relevant. It says, he said, what this means is that although all the features of the world of experience are actually variables, in that their full nature can never be so well revealed that they have been rendered permanently and absolutely predictable. Some things can be taken for granted or treated as constants for some defined purposes in some particular situations for some limited time. So it's all, you see all that cascade of restraints. It's like you create this order, but it's useful for these small little pockets of things, like these areas where we think of as scientific laws that within Wolfram's framework are the computational reducibility that kind of help describe the whole system. Those things are really, they're small, they're hard to stumble across within this vastness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the rules we discover are they're useful for very little spaces in time, right? And they're aging quickly, and then they're not. And so to depend on them as a mode of being for how you move in the world is not a good idea. And that's kind of Peterson's basic point, that you have to have some other way of making of doing decision making outside of that mode of being.
Well, and the beautiful thing about what he was saying in that quote there too is, I have a friend who's a professor of economics, and she uses that kind of a structure when she teaches her students how to think their way through difficult problems. Like, let's say you have to go to an interview at Google, and you know they're going to ask you some random question like, how many ping pong balls would fit on a 747? Fit
Yeah.
on, you know. So she teaches them, first of all, you have to define your terms, and then you have to freeze some of the variables, because everything's variable. You don't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
You have to freeze some variables. And in that way, you can become innovative. You can think outside the box. You can come up with ideas. But that doesn't mean you can solve that problem exactly. You're only going to have theories. You're going to have possibilities. You're going to have a field of possibilities that come out of that.
Right.
That's where innovative thinking comes from. That's where Einstein got his, you know.
And any sort of solution you come up with is going to be good within just that bounded state that you've created, you know, and
Yeah.
and it's good, even with that bounded state, it's going to have this margin of error based on, you know, all the ways in which you thought something was computationally reducible and it really wasn't, but you had to pretend like it was just so you could make some movement forward.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's the other thing. He mentions, I'll read this other quote. He mentions the mathematician Kurt Gödel generated a theorem, Gödel's theorem in 1931, predicated on the idea that any axiomatic mathematical system depends for its integrity on the existence of axioms that cannot be proved or disproved within the axioms of that system. Understanding of this theorem, which essentially states that some quote unquote truths have to be accepted on faith, or at least as pragmatic preconditions for application of the system, allows for some useful insight into how a world too complex for full apprehension might still be categorized and perceived. So there's the formal system by itself is defunct from the get-go. It has, the scientific image has to be nested inside of the manifest image. It has to have this larger perspective. And I think that's where Jordan Peterson's meaning comes in, because I think of meaning from his perspective as this kind of distillation across all these different elements of consciousness that come together in a way very difficult to describe, but you, as a conscious being, you know it when you see it. And that's why Peterson says you got to pay attention to this. Like, things will manifest themselves to you as meaningful, and you're not going to know why, but it's important. Because you can't, if you tried to do the science of why it's important, you're never going to get there in the course of a human life.
And that's the whole thing with patterns, right? Because
Yeah.
that's when the meaning start, that's when the meaning, when the patterns all start to line up, that's where the meaning comes from. So I had two things I wanted to say. First of all, I want to say this whole thing about truth as a process. I got an insight from what you were saying that I had never thought about before. Usually it's made me a little nervous to talk about truth as a process, because that sounds as though God is changeable in some way. But if I think of truth as a process, in that it's always growing, it's always expanding, it's always getting bigger, right?
Which
Because
is what
truth
we
and
see the
reality
universe
line
being.
up somehow. They're the same thing somehow, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it needs to necessarily be scary, because if, again, looking back at Wolfram's system, the underlying process is whereby it's going are still the same. So there can be a sense in which it's not changing, but yet it is growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
yeah.
creating the room for more possibility.
Yeah. So that was one thing I wanted to say. And then the other thing I wanted to say, I just lost it. You had been talking about, before I said that about truth, you had been talking about something else. Oh, patterns. I wanted to show you a painting. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is not totally begun. I mean, this isn't a beginning painting. I'm probably at level 3 on this painting, but you can get some sense of the process that I use. So can you see this kind of weird sloppy pattern here?
Yeah.
So it shows up again here, shows up again here, shows up in a number. You can kind of see it a little bit subtle here. You can see pieces of it everywhere. But when I decided to superimpose a figure on top of it, you can see the black line. I've superimposed the figure. Here's her arm. Here's her head.
Right.
Here's a secondary figure. Here's her hand. And she's kind of running down the center. Now, what I will do as I continue to work on this is I will have to work on these boundary edges so that they're not hard edges. These edges here, we don't want just those hard edges, right? We want something that makes it connect to the rest of the work.
It
Because
needs to be a semi-permeable membrane.
that's right. And you want the unity of the whole to be pleasing, but I don't want to lose the interest of this weird stuff that's in the background.
Yeah.
Because to me, some of that weird stuff is what makes things really interesting. And obviously, I have too much of this patterning going on here. Some of it I will lose, subsume into the background. Some of it will become part of the painting. So this is an example at like level 3. And I'm going to show you one that's almost finished. But the other thing I wanted to point out is in this painting, you see a certain palette. So if I cut a chunk out of this painting and had a pile of chunks of different paintings, you'd know which painting this one fit back into.
Yeah.
Even though there's a lot of chaos, there are things that unite this, even at this point, even though it's not done, there still is some unity here.
Right.
Now here's one that's closer to done. You still see some of this kind of chaotic. I like this particular pattern, so I use it in quite a bit of my work. And you see, when I put the figures in, I decided to use that as part of the figures.
Yeah.
And you see other shapes that keep showing up. These little circles show up in different colors, and you see this strange big red symbolic thing here showing up again over here, but in a slightly different configuration. But that's how the and then these circles are showing up in different places. So, but even in spite of the chaos that's going on, because there's a person in there,
Yeah.
you get some sense that this chaos has some meaning.
Right.
You sort of can imagine meanings that might be in that chaos just because there are some people in the environment.
Right.
Actually, even if there was just a tree, that would be enough. But you kind of need something that is alive to give some sort of place for it. Yeah. This is not one of my favorite paintings. My favorite paintings are the ones where you don't right away notice that a figure is there. You have to go looking for it.
Uh-huh.
But the chaos and the figure.
Do you have an example of one of those?
I don't have one right now. No, I just grabbed these two at the last minute that I could put on screen share. But and this one I'm still working on. I'm not happy with the dog. And there's a few other things I'm not happy with here. I'm still working on it, but I mean, I'm getting there. So
interesting. So you'll work on several paintings at a time. So you're kind of like,
because I'm just almost never finished with something until it gets bought, and then it's gone and I can't be working on it anymore. But I try to stop at a certain point so I don't want to get over literal with it. But I think that there's something very important about so what I wanted to say about pattern is that pattern kind of helps you find your way through. It's kind of like breadcrumbs in the forest or something.
Yeah, it's that computational reducibility.
Yeah,
but if it was all that, you would get bored really quick.
Helps you find your way home, sort of. Yeah. Well, I really, really like what you shared about Barfield. I'm going to have to just bite the bullet and start reading Barfield, I guess.
Yeah, he's. I keep coming back to him. Like the work is difficult, but it's so deep and it's so prescient too. Like I was just thinking about this the other day. Like it really. It predates a lot of scientific discoveries in this field. Like if you think about like the work of like Karl Popper or even Michael Polanyi and Thomas Kuhn, which
Jordan Peterson
mentions in this article, right? In terms of how even within the scientific framework, you have to have this structure through which you observe that structure, right? There's got to be a larger structure that brings meaning to bear upon the thing you're trying to do science in. and that he calls that paradigmatic structure. I don't know. Anyway, but Barfield, like, he really, he's not as good a writer as Lewis, so which is why I don't think his works are widely read or understood. But he really sees where this is all going well ahead of time, and he seems that, I mean, later in his life, he's like, people will read me later and they'll get it. He's like right now, people just don't see it yet. There was that wave of modern optimism of that reducing frame could encapsulate the world and produce infinite progress in science and technology forever. Was just, everybody was in the throes of that spirit, and we're not anymore. We're seeing it break down, and so that does, I think his works will get rediscovered, and be interesting to see how that turns out.
Well, I'm seeing some hopeful things the last few days, in spite of all the chaos and disruption and pain and suffering that's happening everywhere. I'm also seeing some crossovers and some people coming together. And I don't know if you heard about I don't remember what town it was. I don't know if it was Atlanta or some other city where they were having a lot of rioting going on. And when the rioters came up, the policemen laid down their weapons and took off their helmets and
I think it was Miami.
knelt down and asked forgiveness. And of course, the whole crowd just melted. And just
It's
beautiful.
funny, like how something, they all knelt down, and I think there's something about the full-bodied incarnation of being on a knee that is like, it did something that couldn't have been done with any words or anything else. There was something encapsulated in that humility that was transformational.
Yeah, I mean, talk alone would have just turned into more talk, yelling, screaming, whatever, or propositional truth would have gone right down, would have produced disaster at that moment. But that embodied truth of humility and forgiveness and seeking forgiveness, it just changed the whole, Kuhn is always talking about what happens when there's a big paradigm shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what is needed, which is why we're in this pause.
Yeah, but it's always comes with a lot of chaos.
Yeah, but it's that kind of thing that will produce the paradigm shift. And the people I see working in this space are people like Chloe Valdery with her theory of enchantment, and John R. Wood with his Braver Angels group.
Not familiar with either of those. I'll have to check them out.
I would love to talk to either one of them. They're just really great. They just do great things. And I was actually trying to connect Chloe Valdery with Paul, because the other day one of his videos was just like so lined up with her whole theory of enchantment idea. I think she might have been reading Jordan Peterson, because she gets into this thing about how story can help to rewrite our view of the world. And so that's her theory of enchantment, planting a new story in people.
Yeah, I find story to be the most interesting layer to talk about, because I think, I don't know, there's something about it. It's very simple, but it scales almost infinitely, it seems like. And I had this idea the other day. I was watching a TV show that I didn't particularly actually like, but and I was trying to figure out why I didn't like the narrative of the plot and what was going on. And what I realized is that I could tell that the writers didn't like their characters. And then I started thinking about this some more, and I started thinking, I think that I don't know if this is specific to me, or if this is something that you could say is universally applicable to stories, but I would say that you could subsume, for me at least, quality storytelling in that one metric of how much the writers like their characters, and how much they kind of lay down their lives for the character so it can actually live in this real possibility, versus these kind of stultifying and kind of like it's almost like in some stories, it's almost like the writers are playing with the characters, you know, and warping them into different shapes as it suits their needs for this particular plot construction. And then there's other stories where the richness and complexity of the individuals is able to come out. Even some of the minor characters, they still have a life to them, that they're not just the stereotypical guy, you know, in the supermarket. They still have this life to them. I don't know, but that's something
We've
we
been
could talk about in the
rewatching
future.
years ago, my husband and daughter bought me Monk, the whole 6 seasons or whatever of Monk. Did you ever watch Monk?
Maybe, yeah, that was a long time ago, but I think my younger brother was into it, so I saw a few sitting with him.
Okay, well, my daughter used to really love Monk when she was much younger, so we watched the whole thing, and then then my husband got into it, so I watched the whole thing again with him, and then they bought it for me thinking I would want it, but really it's because that's the only thing the two of them will watch together. So altogether, we've probably seen every one of the episodes at least 4 times.
Right.
So when I watch him now, I already know what's coming, and I'm just watching him from the standpoint of the author and the characters. And the thing I really notice is what you just said. The writers, you can tell the writers love these characters because the characters have a lot of foibles. And there's a narrative arc in each one of the characters that at the very beginning, they're really in many ways very either broken or very jerky, very nerdy, weird characters. But in every storyline, there's an opportunity for one of the characters to be loved. And and I don't mean a romantic tryst or anything like that. I just mean that whatever it is that happens to the character in that episode, you can tell that the writers have a deep respect for the pain or the
Exactly. See, that's the thing. That was the other thing I noticed. I could tell in certain instances the characters were experiencing pain that the writers didn't experience. And there was something I don't know, and like, well, how would I know that? Like, I'm just watching a story. How would I know that? I don't know. But I feel like you can tell. I don't know. When the writers, like you just described, are wrestling with the same pain and going through it as well with the character.
Yeah,
There's
and
a different richness.
even sometimes when the character, like the one we watched last night, one of the characters was this woman that you could tell she was not homeless, but she definitely had some real mental challenges. She had some sort of disorder that caused her to treat others and to be a pathological liar and to create problems for other people, and she comes across as very quirky and weird, and yet you knew that she was a person worthy of dignity, and in spite of all the things that she did that were wrong, at the end they don't press charges on her. I don't know how to explain it, but it was just like, and I noticed that with every one of the characters. And Monk himself has got all kinds of problems. He's OCD, and he's always creating problems for people with his OCD. And yet, every one of the characters love him, and you can tell the writers love him. And you can tell that inside of the character, the actor that's playing Monk, he loves him too. You know?
It's funny because, like, in a show, because there is this complex of all these different people that have to lay down their life for this character to live, right?
Yeah.
And if they don't do it, you can tell.
And they have to empty themselves of who they are in order to insert this other character. Because if they're still stuck in that character, then you know, there are some actors that are like that. It doesn't matter what character they play. That's just that person, you know. They haven't emptied themselves and become something else. But to really inhabit a character, you have to empty yourself and inhabit that, and let that character inhabit you, which sometimes can be very negative, like Heath Ledger when he let the Joker become too much of him. You know, did not lead to a good place. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
Maybe the story, do you think the story is the layer of computational reducibility?
I think there's something there. I think there's something really interesting going on there that I can't quite put my thumb on, but I think it's certainly, at least for humans, it is the unit of data compression that is so closely modeled to our biology that we interact with it effortlessly.
Well, maybe that would be a thread for us to move into next time. You can bring in the Barfield thing and we'll look at story as the layer of computational reducibility and data compression. Does that sound like a good topic for next week?
Yeah, and there's that series that Paul's been following along with this YouTube channel called like Stories of Old.
Old, yeah.
Have you watched any
I
of
haven't
those?
watched, yeah, I've watched the first two. I haven't watched the last one, but I
Yeah, I
will
haven't
do
watched
that
the third
before.
one either, but those are interesting. I think we can maybe use those as a kind of backdrop as well.
That'd be good. Sounds
Cool.
good.
Awesome.
Okay. We'll see you next week.
All right. Take care again.
Thanks, Michael. Bye-bye.